Hello and welcome to our chat about mobile app accessibility and how to tackle it. My name is Amy Tom. I am a tech specialist and writer, and I talk about mobile app accessibility and diversity and how to make technology accessible to underprivileged communities. And I'm joined today by Aleksandra Kulbaka, who is a full stack developer and a computer science master's student at Oxford. She used to work at a company where she built a multimedia mobile app and thus started thinking about mobile app accessibility. So, thank you very much, Aleksandra, for joining me today. And I'd love to start by having you introduce yourself and how you got started with app accessibility.
Hi everyone. Hi Amy. Thank you so much for having me. My friend Luke gave a talk about accessibility and inclusive designs. And it really, really inspired me because, honestly, I have never heard about it specifically, from a tech point of view. I have never been taught that on any university course, or I barely saw any articles about that. And it got me thinking, if we are not taught that, how are we supposed to build accessible tools? And then I was trying to find more guidelines on how to do it. And similarly, there's not a single source of truth for mobile accessibility guidelines. You have to dig really, really deeply into the topic to, find really good guidelines, really good practices. So it's something that requires effort from you, while I think, it should be as effortless as possible. It should be very, very simple to implement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And when you talk about specifically building mobile apps, it gets even more complicated because of the lack of resources and help that are available to incorporate accessibility into mobile apps. So before we start getting into like the nitty-gritties of everything, I actually want to start really high level and ask you how you define mobile app accessibility.
Sure. So for me, mobile accessibility is about making sure that the app that we are building can be used by people with as many needs as possible.
Yeah, because so many people also have a disability or something that makes the app inaccessible to them. It's so important. I was reading a study the other day that said it was something about using PDFs or reading PDFs online. And I think that this particular tool, PDF viewer, is applicable to web apps as well, but also to their mobile app. And they said that 27% of their users are using a non-default text size. So many people are like over a quarter of their users are using the accessibility features that they've implemented. So it's so important to build that into your app. So that's why I would love to chat more about that with you.
There's also a thing called temporal disability, which means people who temporarily cannot see. So, for example, if you are using the mobile app on a really bright day, when it's really sunny and you can barely see the screen, and if we make the app more accessible for people with eyesight problem, then we can also allow users who are temporarily disabled to also use the app better. So it's not only focusing on people with disabilities, with accessibility issues, but it's also helping users with no permanent disability to also use the app better. So that's also really something really cool to think about, that we are not only focusing on this 15% of people, but honestly on our whole group of users.
Yeah. And you never know how people are going to interact with your UI. That's the thing. I mean, you can, as an app developer, you can predict how people are going to interact with your UI and you can guide them to how to use the app. But at the end of the day, there is going to be a subset of your users who use the app differently than you maybe like quote unquote intended them to use it. But so, there's some users who don't even touch the screen when they use mobile apps, for example. I think maybe the word disability is like scary to think about, like tackling disabilities, accessibility for disability is scary to think about, but there's so many reasons for accessibility labels and things like that to exist outside of physical disabilities. So going back to the question then, what kind of frameworks and guidelines are available for app accessibility?
Yes, so the biggest one is the Web Content as Accessibility Guidelines. They are developed by W3C, and that's the absolute baseline for all the web content accessibility. And it's really well defined, and you can like use it really well when you develop the website. And even though it's mentioned on the website that they can be very easily used for mobile apps, I don't quite agree with that. Just because mobile apps and websites are built quite differently, they behave quite differently. For example, the bottom sheets are way more popular on the mobile apps than they are on the web. So I feel we need some, mobile app specific guidelines and tips for mobile accessibility. So as I said, I was digging deeper and deeper into that, and I found many different websites like Formidable or Fonka, and they are both companies that work on or specialize even in accessibility. I also read accessibility standards for React Native, and I had a look at Android and iOS specific guidelines.
Yeah.
So they were all really great, but the problem is that they were all in different places, and honestly, like it took me ages to find all of them, to make sense of all of them. So I thought it's best to write them in one place, so then you have access to to all of them. It's quite ironic that the accessibility standards are not very accessible for the developers. So I try to make them more accessible by combining them into one document. Mm-hmm. And then it also allows you to calculate the accessibility score. Because, for example, when I just started, like I didn't know my baseline. I didn't know how accessible my app really is, so I didn't know how much I can improve. And, if maybe my app is good enough, so this accessibility calculator that I made can also help you to calculate the accessibility score of your app. So then by how much you can improve and what's your start point is.
If you were to use the accessibility calculator that you created, what's a good score? How do you know if your app is accessible?
It's a really great question. And, I'd be really tempted to say, if you get the max score, then your app is accessible and you're done. But unfortunately, that is not the case. Because all these guidelines are just guidelines. They are developed to help us, but they are not to tell us if the app is accessible or not. And the only way we can know that the app is accessible is by asking real people, real users to test the app and tell us what they think and give us the feedback. So that's the most important thing we can do, to have like big enough group of testers, diverse group of testers, that could give us the hints on like how to improve the app.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I never thought about that, like building diversity within the testing team, because those are the people who test and see how the users will interact with the app, and thus need to represent the actual target audience or user group. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. Yeah. And what kind of tests are they running to test accessibility? Is it like UI snapshot related testing, or what kind of testing is available to test mobile app accessibility?
Mm-hmm. So from our side, what we can do, we can kind of imitate. I know it sounds really bad, but we can imitate the some accessibility issues. So for example, we can turn on the screen reader that is going to read the whole content of the app out loud, and we can navigate through the app and see if it makes sense. And I started with that because I didn't have any group of testers available. So it was only me who could, check in practice if the app is accessible or not. So I turned on the screen reader, and it was really scary at first, because it was a completely different experience than something that I was used to. So I really had to get out of my comfort zone to test it. So yeah, screen reader is definitely the biggest one. There are some automated tests that you can write for mobile apps, but frankly, they are not very advanced yet. So it's quite tricky to develop that. So I think the best way to test it is to just by manual testing, so someone can just go through the app and see if the app's accessible, compare it with like the standards and see if it varies. So there was an article I read recently, about the fact that even if you have diverse teams who actually build the apps, who create the app, it also helps with, app diversity and accessibility. Just because if you have a wider point of view, then you can tackle more problems. So the app will, help more people in a result. So having diverse teams, like, it's also a great idea. And just to finish off the point of testing, if you, for example, cannot, if it's hard to find, like big enough group of testers yourself, then there are companies that can do it for you. So they specialize in helping companies find like a big unbiased group of testers, like that can test the app, using different. They can test the app from like different points of views. They can test the apps for the accessibility. So that's something really, really cool.
Oh, cool. Okay, I did not know that existed. That's cool. What I want to also understand is actually how teams can get started with mobile app accessibility, because I think like it's good to talk about the theory about why it's important, but how can people incorporate it to make it more accessible, such as like dynamic text, for example, or being able to increase the font size? What would you start with?
Yeah, so I would I would start by having a look at all the standards, all the guidelines, and then I would probably start. That's how I started, by handling the easiest things to change for now. So as you mentioned, for example, enabling the dark mode in the app, or enabling increasing the font size everywhere in the app. Ensuring that the contrast ratio between the images or between the different colors is big enough. So to think like that, but also dynamic text, color ratio, all of these things can also be created by designers when designing the app before actually building it. So it's also important that designers have the accessibility in mind, so they can have a look at all the standards and follow them, because then it's much easier job for developers to actually build this into the app. It's also really important to know the abilities and the limitation of the programming language or framework that you work with. So I would definitely recommend, reading about accessibility in the documentation of the framework that you work with. For example, React Native has really good documentation. And also look for some tools, for some libraries that could help you with that. So again, as an example, Formidable created a really, really cool library called React Native AMA. And it's a library of accessible components that you can very easily incorporate into the app. I think it's literally just, you can do it like within seconds. And they ensure that all the components are accessible, that they have, accessibility tags. And yeah, now I mentioned accessibility tags are also very, very important, because basically this is all the information that the screen reader will have access to when reading out the content of your app. So it's also something really important to incorporate. But again, like when we learn how to program, we learn how to make our algorithms more efficient. We learn how to make sure that our variable names are more understandable. But we never really are taught of making sure that our code that we write is accessible, incorporating these accessibility tags. So it's kind of like a mind shift a little bit.
And okay, I have an interesting question. What about like how much you're putting into your accessibility tags? For example, if you're going to tag a button on your website that said like purchase now, right? Is it enough to say purchase button? Or are you also going to say like orange purchase button, click here to go to the purchase page? Like how in depth are your accessibility labels and tags, I guess is my question.
That is a brilliant question. And I honestly spent a lot of time thinking about it as well. And it took me a lot of iterations and improvements to like find like the best way, I think. So first of all, we need to remember that these accessibility tags shouldn't give like way more information that users who don't use the screen reader have. So for example, if you would say purchase button navigates you to the purchase page and does this and this, like users who don't use screen reader won't know that. They just see the button that says purchase now. So I would avoid putting unnecessary information. And that also means, the fact that the button is red or green or yellow, it doesn't it's not important for the it's not important. It's irrelevant to the whole content of the app. So I would just put the necessary information. So I would just put accessibility label, purchase button. And it's also important that you don't repeat the information. So for example, you can also add the hint that tells you what the button does. So as you said, purchase button navigates to the purchase page. That not only be unnecessary information, but that also would kind of be repeated information. Maybe better example with like play audio button. If you have like play audio, plays the audio. That's
obvious. Exactly. And at a certain point, having accessibility labels like that, where they're super long, makes it almost inaccessible because you have to sit there and listen to the whole description over and over again of something that didn't require description.
Exactly. Yeah. So just try to be as concise as possible, because as you said, it takes a long time to listen to it. So use as little words. I think there's a rule to avoid any in the accessibility label, so to be as concise as possible, but also capture the essence of the button. So what the button really does.
Yeah, which is a skill in itself. That's hard to do.
Yeah, definitely. I think the one I struggled the most were the icon buttons, because how do you even describe that?
Describe it in 2-3 words, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an icon for a reason.
Yeah. And I want to talk about also the idea of building the app for specific users or for a larger user base, because going back to what we were saying, there's very few times where an app is designed specifically for a white cis male or a very specific gender and race and type of person. Very few instances where apps are designed that way. Apps are, for the most part, designed for a very wide audience to maximize the potential user base, right? So when we talk about mobile app accessibility, I wonder if there is a future for app developers, especially as young people coming into the industry or are in our first 10 years of working, right? How can we guide the conversation and change our future, to have app accessibility be more inclusive. So, for example, like what I'm talking about is having apps be more inclusive to and representative of non-binary people, for example, or the LGBTQIA plus community, or people of color, or just underrepresented communities. Is there a future where we can make apps more accessible for everyone?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a brilliant question. And I really, really hope that there is a future. There's a future like that. The idea that you describe is actually called inclusive designs. So that means creating a product that will enable people from all the backgrounds and with all the abilities. So it addresses not only accessibility, but also, as you mentioned, the race, gender, education level, culture, age. In terms of mobile apps, it's as simple as when you have a form with like name inputs or city inputs, make sure they can be used by global audiences, So for example, ensure that like you accept characters from different language, not only English. Make sure you include diverse illustrations in the apps, because as you mentioned, like we often see the illustrations, white male, white female, and that's it. But that's not representative at all of the world. Make sure the inclusive filters are in the app, or when you ask for gender, don't only put two options. It's very easy to implement, and all it takes is awareness.
I wonder, because we have, I mean, even within mobile app accessibility, it's still such a under discussed subject that there is no real, like you said, one true single source of truth for mobile specific guidelines for accessibility. So I wonder like how long it will take for companies like Apple and like Android guidelines and things like that to come up, where we also make inclusivity documentation of how to make apps inclusive. Does that exist already?
That's a really good question. I actually don't know. I know they have some like accessibility guidelines, definitely.
I would love to get to a point in app development in the future of the world and society where, when we think about incorporating app accessibility into the planning stages of app development, we also talk about incorporating inclusivity into the planning stages of app development, because that is where it belongs as well.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of things to be done, but it's really exciting, like we can shape that now, and we can help the future generation to be more accessible, be more inclusive. And that's really, really cool thing to think about.
Yeah, I would love for people to understand that app accessibility happens at all stages of the app development process, especially in the beginning when you're planning, and that accessibility can also include diversity and inclusion in that kind of messaging and planning as well.
Yeah, and all it takes is just awareness. Is this one little thought of you? Like, have we thought of this group of people? Have we thought of fulfilling needs of these people? So it's really not much, and you can start from there. You can start with small changes, and then when you see the output, you can iterate on that, and you can keep improving. Yeah, it's really not that much.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Aleksandra, for chatting with me about mobile app accessibility. I hope that people did take that away and have more awareness now of mobile app accessibility. If people want to find you online, where can we look?
LinkedIn is the best way. So it's Aleksandra Kulbaka on LinkedIn. Please message me. I would love to chat with you.
Amazing.
Yeah, if you have any questions about the guidelines or anything, just give me a message.
Cool. And I will put hopefully I'll be able to put a link to the app accessibility calculator somewhere, maybe in the description of the session, so people can look at that. And you can find me online on LinkedIn as well, Amy Tom, or on Twitter. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to our chat, and hope you have a good rest of the summit.